I was speechless when I saw my wife waiting for her lover for a romantic dinner at the restaurant, and when he arrived, I went over to them and left our rings on the table. "You deserve each other," was all I said before leaving, taking the end of our story with me. She tried to find me later, but what she had with him quickly faded. It wasn't love, it was escape. While she faced silence and regret, I silently rebuilt myself too, until I found a new love with calm eyes and a loyal soul. Years later, she asked me for forgiveness. I accepted, not for her, but for myself. Forgiveness closed the door gently, but didn't reopen it, and that was when she understood the weight of the choice she had made. Betrayal doesn't begin with a kiss. It begins with an absence, with an unseemly silence, with a message read and ignored, with the subtle change in the tone of voice of someone who once said, "I'll be right back," and suddenly doesn't return the same. It begins with a cell phone face down on the table, with a chuckle suppressed in the corner of the mouth as eyes avert, with an apology repeated too often to ring true. I didn't see the betrayal coming. It didn't walk through the door with high heels and cheap perfume. It slipped through the cracks of everyday life, infiltrated our fatigue, our routines, our hurried kisses, our silent Sundays. I didn't see it. And when I did, it was too late. That night, I just wanted to surprise her. I'd chosen the restaurant where we celebrated our first wedding anniversary, made a reservation, bought flowers, and decided I wouldn't say anything, that I'd make her believe it was just another Tuesday. I remember arriving with a light heart, a little nervous, as if we were still two teenagers discovering love. But when I opened the door to the private dining room and saw her there, sitting at the table, beautiful, with makeup on, laughing at something he said while nervously stirring her wine glass, something inside me broke. A dry, discreet sound, like glass cracking inside my chest. They didn't see me right away. I had time to see her eyes light up in a way they hadn't in a long time when she saw me arrive home. I had time to understand, in seconds, that she hadn't betrayed me that night. She'd been away from me for much longer than I cared to admit. As I approached, the world around me fell silent. My voice was firm but dead. I pulled the small velvet bag containing our rings from my pocket. I placed it on the table, among the glasses, the silverware, and the frozen laughter. "You deserve each other," was all I could say. She tried to reach me, to say something, but I was already far away, even there, standing in front of her. I left without looking back. I didn't want to see the expression on her face, didn't want to give her the chance to deny the obvious. Sometimes, the only possible response is silence. And that night, my silence screamed louder than any fight, any accusation. It was the sound of a broken heart learning to stop beating for someone. After that, the days dragged on. The house became too big, too silent. Every corner screamed her name. The cups in the cupboard, the forgotten towel in the bathroom, the scent on the sheets that took weeks to stop carrying her scent. I received messages. Many. Some long and desperate, others short and regretful. But they all carried the weight of her absence when we were still together. And there was no more room for backtracking. Her betrayal wasn't just physical, it was the breaking of a pact we'd built together with years of dedication, dreams, and plans that now existed only in memories and photographs. She tried everything. She showed up at the gate crying, sent gifts, letters, recorded audio messages, and asked for forgiveness, looking into my eyes. But what she destroyed couldn't be put back together. And not because I hated her. But because I had learned, painfully, that forgiveness isn't synonymous with reconciliation. Some people we need to forgive precisely so we can leave them in the past. While she wallowed in her own regret, trying to undo what was impossible to reverse, I silently rebuilt myself. I started running early in the morning, went back to reading the books I'd set aside, reconnected with friends, rediscovered my own reflection. For a long time, I was just someone's husband. Then, I was the betrayed one. Until one day, I was just me again. Whole, even with the scars. And that's when I met someone. Not like in the movies, not in a romantic stumble through the aisles of a bookstore. It happened slowly. In an unpretentious conversation that turned to laughter, over a shared coffee one late afternoon, in a comfortable silence. She didn't want to heal my wounds. She just wanted to be there. Over time, I realized there was something about her I'd forgotten existed: peace. She didn't look at me as if she needed something, but as if she was willing to add. And it was with her that, years later, I discovered that loving again was possible, even after such a hard fall. It wasn't the same love. It was different. More mature, calmer, more genuine. And I knew for the first time in a long time that I didn't need to look back anymore. But the past insists on knocking on the door when we least expect it. Years later, on an ordinary morning, she appeared. The woman who betrayed me. Older, more tired, with sad eyes that said more than any words. She asked me for forgiveness. She didn't beg, she didn't cry. She just asked. And in that moment, I understood that I had reached a point I never thought possible. I forgave her. Not for her. But for myself. Because holding a grudge was carrying a weight that no longer belonged to me. I forgave her with a discreet smile, with calm eyes, and told her it was okay. But I also told her, tenderly and firmly, that our time together was over. Forgiveness closed the door gently, but didn't reopen it. And it was there, in that silent moment, that she understood the weight of the choice she had made. She didn't cry in front of me. But her eyes said it all. What she never knew, however, is that that week, as she returned home with the echo of my forgiveness resonating within her, I was about to leave. A weekend inside, a small cabin, serene company, and two hearts aligned by the same silence that once destroyed me, and now rebuilt me. While she drowned in what she lost, I finally discovered what it was like to live with someone who wasn't afraid to stay. The irony of fate is that she only realized what she'd lost when it was too late. And I had already ceased to be hers long before that betrayal. She was merely the final point of a story that was already dying in entire chapters. But there's something I haven't told you yet. A last conversation, a last choice, something that happened years later and became the invisible thread that connects everything. Because sometimes, true love doesn't end with betrayal. It survives hidden, waiting to be recognized, or buried once and for all. What did she do when she discovered I was no longer alone, when she realized time had not waited for her? That's where the story truly begins. Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize and we never support any kind of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry deep emotional truths, because the moral of each plot is clear: betrayal destroys bonds, hearts and futures. These are stories to reflect on, feel and understand the real weight of choices. Now, get ready. You are about to hear a shocking, intense and unforgettable story. The first time Daniel saw Clara, it was as if something ancient and silent inside him had awakened. It wasn't a dramatic encounter, nor was it planned. It was just an ordinary late afternoon, in a corner cafe, amid the hustle and bustle of people already preparing for the end of the week. Clara sat alone, absently fiddling with her phone, a half-empty cup of tea and a book open in front of her. There was an almost uneasy serenity about her, as if the world were spinning at a different pace around her. Daniel, coming from a series of failed relationships and still-healed heartbreaks, felt a familiar unease, that fear of feeling too much. But he didn't have time to back away. She smiled, and that was the beginning of what they would both later describe as the most unlikely and necessary encounter of their lives. In the first few months, everything seemed to fall into place with a frightening naturalness. Clara was light-hearted, full of opinions, laughing easily, but also prone to profound silences. She had a provocative intelligence and a restless way of questioning everything around her. Daniel, more restrained, more methodical, found in her the perfect counterpoint to his rational calm. While she was storm and impulse, he was shelter and constancy. The contrast between them didn't distance them, on the contrary, it created an almost poetic balance. He made her feel safe, and she reminded him that life requires more than just planning. It was as if they recognized in the other an ancient absence being filled. The relationship evolved quickly, but with the naturalness of someone who had known each other for years. In less than a year, they decided to move in together. They found a small but cozy apartment on a quiet street. Clara took care of the decorating details, enjoying making the space reflect their shared personality, while Daniel worried about the bills, the deadlines, and what was needed to keep everything running smoothly. At night, he would watch her sleep and feel a kind of peace he had never experienced before. This was love. Not the idealized love seen in movies, but real love, made of good days, not so good ones, laughter over dinner and arguments over small things, but always ending in apologies and tight hugs. They both had their routines, their jobs, their individualities, but they liked to find refuge in each other at the end of the day. Daniel was a financial analyst at a stable company, someone with an organized routine and set schedules. Clara, on the other hand, was a literature teacher, and her life was full of unexpected events and intense moments. She sometimes arrived late, took piles of papers home to grade, but she loved what she did and spoke passionately about her students, her books, her classes. Daniel listened, even without understanding all the references, and enjoyed watching her shine as she spoke. He fell a little more in love every time she spoke with her eyes, and that was almost always. On weekends, they made a point of cooking together. It was almost a ritual. Daniel carefully tended the ingredients, Clara improvised seasonings, changed recipes, and made jokes. Between glasses of wine, they shared plans, memories, and fears. They talked about the future naturally, marriage, children, a bigger house. Not as if pressuring, but as if building a space where the other could rest. They had mutual friends, planned trips, shared playlists. It was a relationship with deep roots, nourished by patience and a desire to endure. To outsiders, they were the perfect couple. And for a time, they were. But time, silent and impartial, imposed itself with its relentless routine. The days began to pass faster, conversations became shorter, hugs more spaced out. Not for lack of love, but perhaps out of fatigue. Daniel, always so present, began to become too attached to work, to goals, to the silent pressure of being the mainstay of everything. Clara, still in love, began to feel alone even when she was with someone. She tried to talk, tried to get closer, but Daniel often didn't notice. He was there, but he couldn't see. He was nearby, but he was absent. They still loved each other, but love, sometimes, doesn't scream. It just keeps quiet, waiting to be noticed. And when it isn't, it withdraws. Still, there were good moments. Moments when Daniel would turn off the computer early and pick her up from school by surprise, or when Clara would prepare his favorite dinner on an ordinary day. Small gestures that still existed, but didn't fill the voids that had begun to form. She started arriving later, talking less about her days. He began to avoid questions, perhaps afraid of the answers. They didn't fight. They didn't hurt each other. They just let things settle into a comfortable, and, at the same time, destructive, silence. The absence of conflict is sometimes what kills the quickest. Because no one realizes that love is dying when everything seems too calm. Clara began seeking refuge outside the home. Not necessarily in other people, but in places where she could breathe without feeling the weight of routine. Courses, events, coffees with friends. Daniel, meanwhile, buried himself in spreadsheets and goals, believing that this was how he demonstrated love, by providing, being stable, being there. The problem is, sometimes being there isn't enough. And what once united them so strongly became what drove them apart. She wanted to be heard, he wanted to be respected. They both wanted to be loved, but they no longer knew how to show it to each other. Despite everything, there was still respect, the memory of everything they had experienced. Sometimes, a song would make them smile simultaneously. A dish, a smell, a photograph. There was love. But there was also distance. And it was in this gap, between the love that still held out and the abyss that slowly opened up, that the most difficult decisions began to emerge. Not overnight. But like everything that truly ends, silently, slowly, almost without anyone noticing. Daniel still looked at Clara with admiration, but with a certain fear in his eyes. As if he knew she was pulling away but didn't know how to hold her. Clara, in turn, still smiled at him, but with a weariness in her shoulders, as if carrying something she couldn't quite put into words. The intimacy between them still existed, but it had become fragile, full of noises and unspoken words. The complicity that once made them laugh with just a look now seemed dormant, waiting to be awakened, or buried for good. The decision to travel for a weekend was a trial. Clara suggested they spend 2 days away from it all, just the two of them, without cell phones, without distractions. Daniel agreed immediately, as if grasping for a last chance. They packed their bags, chose a quiet place, and for the first time in months, they seemed to be in the same rhythm. During the trip, they talked more, laughed at silly things, rekindled something that seemed lost. Daniel began to believe they were finding each other again. Clara, on the other hand, still harbored a shadow in her eyes, something he couldn't quite grasp. Upon their return, everything seemed lighter. But only for a moment. Everyday life took over once more, the silences grew longer, and the gaps between one affectionate gesture and the next grew longer. What they didn't know was that their story was heading toward a point of no return. And every small gesture, every subtle choice, every swallowed word, and every averted glance were setting the stage for a moment that would change everything. But for now, they were still together. There were still shared dinners, laughter on the couch, hands that touched out of habit and, perhaps, a desire to continue. There were still the "good morning," the "how are you," the "I love you," said before bed. And there was still, deep down, the silent hope that it was all just a phase. That love, however stifled, could still breathe. After all, love stories don't always die explosively. Sometimes they die with a light kiss, an automatic caress, a hug that no longer warms. But Daniel and Clara didn't know that yet. Not yet. For a time, Daniel and Clara's life continued like a river that, even under threat of drying up, insisted on flowing, clinging to vestiges of a rich past. The days came and went, routines intertwined as if nothing had changed, and the world around them seemed to believe they were still the same couple as before. But they weren't. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible, but real difference. In their gestures, in their disguised absences, in the weariness that welled up in Clara's eyes, and in Daniel's silent effort to pretend he didn't see. The love between them still existed, but it was being tested, strained by something invisible that slowly grew, like cracks spreading through a wall that once seemed solid. Clara seemed to have a different rhythm. Her schedules became less predictable, her conversations drier, her eyes less present. Daniel noticed, of course, but blamed himself for it. He imagined it might be work exhaustion, the weight of responsibilities, or even the effect of the monotony that haunts long-term relationships. He tried to compensate with small gestures, notes left in the kitchen, flowers on the bed, texts in the middle of the afternoon asking how she was. Sometimes she responded with an emoji, sometimes she took hours to reply, sometimes she said nothing at all. And he, to avoid suffocating, to avoid appearing controlling, kept quiet. Dinners became silent. Daniel would talk about his day, but received vague nods in response. Clara spoke less. She often ate quickly and went upstairs to her room with some vague excuse. There was a new tone in her voice, impatient, aloof. Daniel tried not to entertain negative thoughts, but his uneasiness grew. He began to notice details, her excessive care with her cell phone, which used to be left on the table and now never left her pocket, the new clothes she started wearing to go out, even on simple occasions, the different perfumes, the way her smile came all too easily when she got distracted in the middle of a phone conversation. He noticed, but he preferred to doubt himself rather than face what he feared most. One Saturday afternoon, Clara said she was going out to meet an old friend from college. Daniel suggested accompanying her, but she declined with forced politeness. She said they needed some time apart, that it was good to maintain individual friendships, that she trusted him and expected the same. He agreed, but something inside him weighed heavily. He sat in the living room for hours, remote control in hand, the television tuned to some random channel. Nothing made sense. The feeling of emptiness seemed greater than ever. And for the first time, he considered following her. But he didn't. There was still a remnant of trust within him, or perhaps fear of facing what he would discover. The following days were even stranger. Clara was present, but distant. It was like living with a shadow, a presence that no longer connected. Daniel began to sleep less, waking up in the middle of the night and staring at the ceiling, trying to understand where they had lost their way. He tried to remember the last time they made love, the last time they laughed together, the last time they looked into each other's eyes without rushing. The memory seemed cruelly distant. And what hurt most was that he still loved her. He still dreamed of her, still thought of her when he heard certain songs, still caught himself imagining children with her smile. But with each passing day, he felt those dreams slowly crumbling, and he was the only one trying to hold them together. The following Tuesday, something happened. Clara announced she had a work dinner, an end-of-semester get-together with the professors, and that she'd be back late. The excuse seemed common, but there was something about the way she styled her hair, her choice of dress, the light tone of her voice. Daniel smiled and hoped she had a good time, but as soon as the door closed behind her, the silence in the house became unbearable. He stood in the hallway, trying to understand what he was feeling. It wasn't anger, nor jealousy. It was anguish. An anguish that only grows when the heart knows what reason refuses to accept. That night, Daniel left home aimlessly. He got in his car, drove through the quiet streets, past places they used to frequent together, searching for answers in the red lights, in the unfamiliar faces of pedestrians. Until, by instinct, or by an impulse he could never explain, he decided to go to the restaurant where they had celebrated their first anniversary. He didn't know why, but something was pulling him there. And when he parked the car, still unsure of what he was looking for, time seemed to stand still. Through the window, he saw her. Sitting at the back table, her hair loose over her shoulders, her hands intertwined with another man's. They laughed, talked, shared wine. Clara was beautiful. Beautiful in a way he hadn't seen her in a long time. Beautiful in a way she'd never been to him again. Daniel stood there, motionless, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. The world around him seemed to disappear. He felt his stomach churn, his throat dry, and his soul shatter into 1,000 pieces. It wasn't just the pain of betrayal. It was the realization that she was no longer his. That, perhaps, she never would be again. It took a few minutes before he was able to get out of the car. He walked toward the restaurant as if floating, each step weighing more than the last. When he entered, Clara hadn't seen him yet. The man in front of her was saying something that made her laugh, and she was touching his arm familiarly. Daniel didn't hear what they were saying. He didn't need to. His body spoke for them. His gaze spoke for them. His indifference spoke for them. He approached the table with a calm he hadn't known he possessed. He took a small velvet bag from his pocket, the one where he kept his rings. Without saying a word, he placed the bag on the table, right between them. Clara froze. The laughter died on her lips. The man stopped speaking. Daniel looked at her, his eyes steady, tired, but tearless. And he simply said, "You deserve each other." He turned and left. Unhurriedly, without fuss. Outside, the air seemed lighter, even though his heart weighed more heavily than ever. He walked toward his car with the certainty that something had ended forever. There were no more doubts, no more assumptions. The truth had been laid bare before him. And with it came the end of everything he'd built with that woman. There was nothing left to save, nowhere left to run. All that was left was to keep going. But what he didn't yet know, what he was about to discover, was that this betrayal was just the surface of something much larger. Something that had been carefully hidden, protected with lies, and that would change everything he thought he knew about his own history. The pain I felt that night was still only the beginning. For days after the dinner where everything fell apart, Daniel remained silent. He didn't reply to messages, didn't answer calls, didn't speak to anyone. He just walked. He walked through hallways of the house he no longer felt was his, through streets that seemed to belong to another version of himself, through memories that now hurt more than warmed. There was something in the void Clara had left, a kind of pain that didn't scream, but gnawed silently. Pride told him he was right to have walked away, that no justification could erase what he'd seen with his own eyes. But his heart, in tatters, still throbbed with her absence. And it was this conflict between reason and feeling that kept him awake at dawn, staring at the ceiling, wondering if there was something he didn't know, something beyond the betrayal. There were gaps that remained unfilled, words that seemed rehearsed, and a look Clara had given him the moment she saw him there, standing there, staring at them both. It wasn't just shock. It was fear. A week later, she showed up at his door. She didn't warn him, didn't text him first. She just knocked. Daniel was on the couch, trying to read, his body present but his mind wandering elsewhere. When he opened the door, he stood still. She was there, her hair tied up messily, wearing a loose t-shirt, and her eyes puffy. She wasn't the woman he'd seen at the restaurant. She was someone else. A broken, confused woman, her hands shaking and her breathing ragged. He said nothing. He just stepped aside to let her in. They sat across from each other, like two strangers needing to negotiate a past. The silence spoke first, thick, awkward. Until she took a deep breath and said she needed to tell the truth, all of it. Daniel crossed his arms, his face serious, but inside a storm of emotions was building. Clara began by saying she didn't expect forgiveness, nor a second chance, that she knew what she had destroyed. But there was something he deserved to know, something he had been keeping hidden for a long time, and that now, with everything lost, there was no point in hiding it. He didn't interrupt her. He simply listened, observing every word, every hesitation. She said she didn't meet the other man by chance. That he didn't suddenly appear, and that it wasn't just an escape or a distraction. That they knew each other even before she and Daniel met. That there was a past between them, something old, unfinished, and that, for a long time, she thought they would never cross paths again. But life, as always, took care of its ups and downs. He returned. He returned and sought her out, even though he knew she was married. They started chatting casually, exchanging messages about their college days, reminiscing about seemingly harmless stories. But gradually, their conversations took on a different tone, and what should have been just a memory became a temptation she couldn't, or didn't want, to resist. Daniel tried to control his breathing. He already knew this part. But something in her eyes told him the real blow was yet to come. Clara hesitated. She said there was something else. Something she'd hidden not just from him, but from everyone. A mistake she'd made long before she fell in love with Daniel. A secret she'd carried like a silent burden throughout their marriage. And which, at that reunion, had come to the surface with brutal force. She paused for a few seconds, her eyes fixed on his, as if seeking permission to continue. Daniel merely nodded, tense but ready. Clara said that years ago, when she was still in college, she had a turbulent relationship with this same man. It was intense, marked by back and forth, lies, forced forgiveness, and an unhealthy love. She became pregnant by him. It was unexpected, mismanaged, and in the end, she lost the baby. Her grief was silent, lived alone, and the relationship ended there. After that, she promised herself she would bury it all. She met Daniel months later, and in him she saw a chance to start over. That's why she never told him. Out of shame, out of fear of losing everything, out of a desire to erase that chapter of her life. But when the man reappeared, all those memories came flooding back. And with them, something she thought she had buried returned, the feeling of being indebted to the past. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. Not because of what she had said, but because he felt that wasn't all there was to it. Clara then looked at him and delivered the final blow. She said that 3 months before the dinner, she discovered the man was engaged. That he'd kept the relationship a secret, promising it would end, that everything would change, that they would go back to being the way they were. And that was when she fell for it. For the second time, she surrendered herself to a man who lied, who deceived, who made empty promises. But she wanted to believe. She was needy, feeling invisible, and deep down, she wanted to punish Daniel for letting her feel alone for so long. But what she didn't expect was for the other man to betray her too. A betrayal within a betrayal. A cruel irony. In the end, the man broke things off with her via text message. He said he would return to his fiancée, that Clara was just a mess from the past, that he couldn't destroy the life he was building. And there she was, with her marriage destroyed, her pride torn apart, with the 2 men she once loved rejecting her. She was alone. She had no one else. And that's why she was there now. Not asking for forgiveness. But admitting she lost everything. And that the biggest mistake wasn't cheating, but choosing to run away instead of facing it. Seeking refuge in the old, instead of building a new one with the one who truly stood by her side the whole time. Daniel said nothing for a long time. The silence seemed to echo inside him, piercing his bones, shattering memories. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but firm. He said he didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal or the fact that she'd carried it all alone for years, pretending to be someone he never imagined. That it was as if their entire relationship had been built on a lie, on something he'd never had the chance to know. He said he didn't know if he'd ever be able to trust anyone again, but that, strangely, he didn't feel hate. He felt pity. For the woman she could have been, for the love they could have saved, for the words she chose to hide when they needed to be said most. She cried. Silently. Daniel got up, grabbed his car keys, and before leaving, told her that maybe one day she would be able to forgive herself. But now, he had to move on. Because what she destroyed couldn't be rebuilt. Not anymore. And as the door closed behind him, Clara sat on the living room floor and realized that, finally, she was truly alone. For the first time, the weight of everything fell upon her. The silence in the house was deafening. And in that moment, she knew that the love she had lost wasn't something you find twice in a lifetime. She knew that the pain she felt didn't come from rejection, but from the knowledge that she had done it all alone. That no one had taken her away from Daniel. That no one had pushed her into the arms of another. That it was she. She had chosen. And there, deep in that silence, a final question formed. Because there was something that still wasn't clear, something Daniel would discover not long after. And when that happened, everything would change again. In the days that followed, Daniel didn't return home. He took his car, drove to the countryside, and stayed in a simple inn, surrounded by tall trees and the absolute silence he so desperately needed. He was exhausted by sounds, by justifications, by memories that insisted on lingering in his mind like heavy shadows. In that place, far from everything, he allowed himself for the first time to look at his own life with brutal honesty. The last few years had passed like a film without cuts, without pauses, and only now could he realize how much he had lost himself. He had spent too much time trying to hold together something that was already crumbling inside. He had tried to save a love that only he still nurtured. But now it was different. The ground had already given way, the walls had crumbled. And he finally accepted that he needed to build something new, even if it was from scratch. He walked a lot. He took nearby trails, left his cell phone off for hours, read parts of books he never finished. And one afternoon, in the inn's small cafe, he met someone. A woman who was also alone, but didn't seem empty. Her eyes were calm, but her presence was firm. They began with brief exchanges, comments about the weather, discreet compliments about the place, small talk about books and music, and gradually, these conversations became spontaneous encounters at the cafe table, then walks, and, later, confidences. Daniel didn't feel pressured. It wasn't love yet. But it was something clean, without noise. And for the first time in a long time, he felt he was being seen for who he truly was, without expectations, without guilt, without weight. While Daniel relearned how to breathe, Clara returned every day to a house where the silence grew increasingly deafening. She tried to occupy herself with tasks she hadn't done before. She tried to clean the house, rearrange the furniture, maintain her routine. But everything seemed pointless. Time passed slowly. She began to go out less, to avoid people, to decline invitations. She knew that, little by little, the friends she'd shared with Daniel were also drifting away. There were glances that avoided her, smiles that no longer reached her. And no matter how much she tried to convince herself it was just a phase, the truth throbbed: she was alone, and the only true love she'd ever had in her life, she herself had broken. Clara tried to contact her a few more times, sending short messages, some without a response, others with polite but cold replies. In one of them, Daniel simply said he was fine and hoped she was too. But he said nothing more. He didn't ask how she was, showed no interest whatsoever. And that hurt more than any previous silence. Because now, she knew, he was moving on. And that was exactly what she confirmed when, 3 months later, she saw him by chance at a cultural event in the city. He was different. Thinner, calmer, with a sparkle in his eyes she couldn't remember seeing before. And beside him was the woman he'd met at the inn. There were no exaggerated displays of affection. But there was complicity in his gestures, a tranquility in his gaze, a kind of connection that only exists when two souls meet, ready to meet. Clara watched them from afar, her heart heavy, and wanted to leave. But she stayed. She saw him laugh, when he took her hand naturally, when he politely said goodbye to acquaintances. And she saw, most of all, when he walked past her and didn't stop. He just met her gaze for a second, gave a slight nod, and continued walking. It was at that moment that she understood he no longer loved her. Days later, Clara wrote a letter. Not to win him back, nor to insist. But to close a door she herself had left ajar. She delivered it by hand, asking only that he read it whenever he wanted. Daniel accepted without a word, put the envelope in his pocket, and only read it a week later, at home, alone. The letter was honest, simple, and unadorned. It said she had finally understood everything he tried to convey with his gestures and absences. She said she no longer expected anything from him, that the forgiveness he offered was the greatest gesture of love anyone had ever given her, and that, for that reason, she needed to forgive herself too. She concluded by saying she hoped he would be happy, that he would have the easy life she hadn't been able to build with him, and that the new woman in his life would be what she never managed to be. Daniel stared at the letter for a while, unsure of what to feel. The pain had gradually faded. A faint melancholy remained, an old longing for what could have been, but nothing that tied him to the past. He put the letter away in a box where he kept old memories and decided not to respond. Not out of indifference, but because he had already said everything with his silence. His life was different now. And time doesn't forgive those who insist on living on returns. Months later, Daniel and his new partner decided to move in together. It wasn't a hasty decision, nor was it driven by need. It was something natural, like everything between them. He found a home in her. A place of peace, of exchange, of truth. And even though the ghost of his old relationship still haunted some of his nightly thoughts, he knew he was where he needed to be. He felt whole, not because of the new woman's presence, but because he had managed to rebuild himself, understand his mistakes, his silences, and make peace with everything he had lost. And then, just when everything seemed to be back on track, something unexpected happened. One day, when he opened his old email, the one he rarely used, only for records and bills, he found a message from an unknown address. The title was simple, I hope you know. Upon opening it, he found a series of attached photos. In all of them, Clara and the man she cheated on him with. But these weren't ordinary photos. They were recent images. The two of them together, but not as a couple. In one, he was handing flowers to another woman, while Clara watched from afar, almost hidden behind a tree. In another, Clara was sitting on a park bench, crying, while the man argued with her while standing, pointing somewhere. In another, she was seen leaving a building with a blank look in her eyes, and soon after, he was seen laughing with friends in a restaurant. The message said just one sentence: not everything you think you lost, was really a loss. Daniel stood motionless for minutes. It was as if something had been handed to him without his asking, a missing piece of the puzzle. He felt no pleasure. No revenge. He felt only a strange compassion. The woman he loved, who had destroyed everything with her own hands, was now a shadow of herself, haunted by choices she couldn't handle. What she had with the other man had crumbled too quickly. It wasn't love. It was escape. A leak that cost her dearly. And she paid the price every day, with the silence of those who walked away, with the gaze of those left behind. He closed the computer, slowly stood up, looked out the window, and took a deep breath. He didn't feel joy at what he saw. He felt certainty. Certainty that, even after suffering, even after being betrayed, he had won. Because he didn't let hate fester inside him. Because he didn't let pain define him. Because, despite everything, he chose to keep loving, even if it was himself. And as night fell outside, he knew the story had truly ended. Not with screams, nor with desperate pleas. But with the rarest and most powerful form of liberation, the silence of those who have learned to move on. Daniel spent the days following that email in a state of inner stillness that surprised even himself. It was as if something inside him, still resisting keeping an old pain alive, had finally understood that there was nothing left to hold on to. The image of Clara in the photos no longer provoked anger or hurt in him, only a gentle, almost distant sadness, as if he were watching someone else's story. He knew he was no longer the protagonist of that story, that life had led him to a place where all that remained was the choice between carrying on or letting go. And he chose to let go. With all the complexity that decision required. It wasn't immediate relief, nor magical liberation, but a process that required courage each day, a mature acceptance of what was lost and what was never fully had. It was during this period that he began to look more deeply at his own journey. He realized that he had, indeed, neglected important things during his marriage. He wasn't to blame for the betrayal, but he had contributed, albeit unintentionally, to the erosion of their bond. He had hidden behind the comfort of routine, avoided difficult conversations, and taken refuge in work as an excuse to avoid facing the distance that was slowly growing between them. Recognizing this wasn't about blaming himself, but about understanding himself. And this understanding gave him the strength to avoid repeating the same patterns, to be more attentive, more present, more whole. With the woman who was now by his side, he practiced this new way of loving. It wasn't about making up for the past, but about building a future without the same mistakes. She was different in many ways, and this constantly challenged him. She had a discreet but firm sensitivity that brooked no superficiality. And Daniel needed to be attentive, emotionally available, open to deconstructing old certainties. They weren't living in a fairy tale, and he appreciated that. There were arguments, moments of estrangement, but there was also dialogue, genuine listening, a desire to grow together. It was a relationship that required maturity. A kind of love that arises after the storm, when one learns that love alone sustains nothing. It requires commitment, presence, truth. And that was what he focused on now. Meanwhile, Clara continued to navigate the maze of the consequences of her choices. She had decided to stay in the same house for a while, perhaps out of attachment, perhaps out of fear of changing everything at once. She tried to rebuild her life slowly, returning to old habits, trying to reconnect with some social connections, even though most of the people she had previously known had drifted away. People's perspectives had changed, even without explicit words. Smiles were cautious, invitations were rare, and the few encounters she did have were marked by a kind of tension in the air. She wasn't seen as a victim. And that hurt. Not because she wanted pity, but because she now realized how far she had distanced herself to live an illusion. The image of the other man also faded over time. She no longer felt anger, desire, or longing. She felt shame. For the way she'd given herself up, for how she'd allowed herself to be used, for how she'd deluded herself into thinking that this reunion would be a chance to start over. It wasn't. It was a repetition of the same cycle of heartbreak, and now, with the added aggravation that she'd destroyed something real to experience it. She began to avoid the places they'd frequented together, deleted contacts, blocked profiles, but what truly hurt her wasn't his presence, it was Daniel's absence. It was knowing that he had moved on, and that she was no longer even part of the happy memories he held. And this complete exclusion was the most silent punishment anyone could receive. One day, Clara received an unexpected call. It was from Daniel's mother, a woman she greatly respected and with whom she had a close relationship throughout her marriage. The voice on the other end was neutral, polite, but firm. His mother wanted to give him some things Clara had left in their old house, documents, photographs, old letters that, through carelessness or grief, had been left behind. Clara thanked her, arranged a time, and, after hanging up, sat for several minutes, staring into space. I knew it wasn't just about picking up boxes. It was a rite of passage. A final goodbye to the remnants of what had once been their shared life. When she arrived at Daniel's mother's address, she was greeted politely, but without warmth. The woman didn't want to go into details, simply pointing to the room where the boxes were. Clara picked them up one by one, without rummaging through them. But as she left, the woman told her something that had been lingering in her mind for days. He said he hoped she truly knew what she had done. And that, although Daniel had moved on, there were wounds that would never fully heal. He said this, looking her in the eye, without anger, but with the genuine pain of someone who has seen a child shattered inside. Clara didn't respond. She had nothing to say. He simply lowered his eyes, nodded, and left with the weight of the boxes in his hands and twice as much weight on his shoulders. In the following weeks, Clara decided to move. She understood that staying there was a self-imposed punishment, an unconscious way of keeping close to a pain that no longer belonged to her. She found a smaller, simpler apartment and started over on her own. Gradually, she returned to teaching at a social project, read more, studied, and turned inward. But she no longer sought to fill the void with new stories. It was time to understand herself. She understood that the forgiveness Daniel gave her was something rare. Because he didn't need to diminish her to free himself. He didn't yell, he didn't take revenge, he didn't expose her. He simply walked away. And because of that, the weight of the wrong choice was even more cruel. Because when the person you destroy chooses not to destroy you back, the mirror that remains is unforgiving. Daniel, in turn, began receiving invitations to speak at small businesses about emotional resilience. His way of dealing with grief, with dignity and silence, had inspired friends and colleagues. He never exposed himself in detail, but spoke authentically about personal reconstruction, about the process of understanding losses as part of life, not punishments. And the more he spoke, the more he realized he had become a different man. A lighter, more whole, more attentive man. The trauma of betrayal still lingered in some fold of his past, but it no longer governed his feelings. The new love he was experiencing was quieter, more mature, without the fear of repeating old stories. And then, late one afternoon, she received a letter in the mail. No return address. Upon opening it, she recognized Clara's handwriting. It was brief, just a few lines written by hand on plain white paper. She said she didn't expect a reply. She just wanted him to know that she now understood. Not just what he felt, but what she had destroyed within herself. She said that, seeing him with someone else, she finally understood that love isn't what you feel, it's what you care for. And that she didn't care. She ended by saying she forgave him too, for not being able to save her from herself. And that she hoped, with all her heart, that he would never stop believing in love, even after what he had been through. Daniel read it, folded it carefully, and put it in a drawer. He didn't feel like responding. Nor did he need to. The letter asked for nothing. It simply closed a door with the maturity of someone who has learned. He got up, went to the balcony where his partner was watering some plants, and hugged her from behind. They stood there, in silence, watching the sky change colors. Life went on, and now, everything was exactly where it needed to be. But there was still one last conversation to be had. An unexpected reunion, one that would bring the definitive end to this story. And when he arrived, it would not be with anger, nor with pain, but with the serenity of someone who has learned that some losses are, in fact, deliverances in disguise. It was early autumn when Clara saw, for the first time, the full picture of what she had done. Not as an isolated memory or latent remorse, but as an entire film, with a beginning, middle, and end, in which she was neither victim nor heroine. She was simply a woman who made bad choices and, for a long time, believed the world was punishing her unfairly for them. But not anymore. Now, with time stacked between the last time she saw him and the present, she saw without distortions. Daniel's absence no longer hurt like an open wound, but like the absence of something that would never return, and therefore needed to be buried once and for all. It was a gray afternoon, and she was walking through a book fair in a remote neighborhood when she saw a poster with his name on it, advertising a lecture on emotional overcoming. It paralyzed her. Not because she still expected something from him, that time had passed, but because she understood that, without knowing it, she still carried him. And that perhaps, that was the last piece of everything they had once shared. Without thinking much, he bought the ticket and decided to go. The event would take place a week later, in a discreet cultural center with few chairs and an intimate atmosphere. When she arrived, the place was almost full. She sat in the back, in the corner, discreetly, with her hair tied back and her face bare, as if she wanted to be invisible. When Daniel entered, with a serene expression and calm demeanor, she recognized him immediately, but her heart didn't race. It was like seeing an old, distant friend, someone she knew very well but who now lived a different life. The talk began, and he spoke about choices, losses, and rebuilding. He didn't mention names or outline profiles. He spoke soberly, lightly. He shared snippets of his experience, leaving silences for those who wanted to fill in with their own stories. And it was there, between words spoken without accusation, that Clara wept softly for the first time in months. Because there, before him, she understood that the love between them had ended, yes, but that the respect of those who once truly loved each other could live on, even if silent. At the end of the talk, a few people approached to say thank you, take photos, and ask quick questions. Clara remained seated, watching. As the audience began to leave, she stood, hesitated for a moment, and walked over to him. Daniel saw her before she could say anything. And for the first time in a long time, his gaze held neither pain, nor anger, nor indifference. It was simply calm. Clara said she wasn't there to talk about the past, that she wasn't expecting any difficult conversations, nor forgiveness, nor closure. She said she just wanted to say thank you. Not for the talk, not for the words, but for everything. Because it was through the pain of losing him that she finally found herself. She said his presence in her life, even though now distant, had been the only true love she had ever experienced, and that she would carry that with humility, as part of who she was. Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked at her with a calmness Clara never expected to see again. And after a while, he simply said he was at peace. That their path had been hard, painful, but necessary. And that, in a way, he was grateful too. Because it was through all of that that he had become who he was now. And then, without ceremony, he sincerely wished her happiness. That she would find something that wouldn't make her run away, that would make her stay. Clara smiled, a fragile but genuine smile. And they said goodbye. There was no hug, no exchange of numbers, no promises of the future. There was just a silent goodbye, the kind that ends cycles with a dignity not everyone can achieve. In the following months, life went on as it should. Daniel continued with his routine, now more focused on working with people, lectures, and workshops. His relationship with his new partner evolved naturally, solidly, and unhurriedly. They traveled together, adopted a dog, and shared bills and silences with the same ease. He learned to share old pain without transferring it, and she learned to listen without trying to heal. It was a mature, conscious love, built with patience and truth. And that was precisely what kept him going. The certainty that he no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, not even to himself. Clara, on the other hand, transformed pain into purpose. She volunteered for a project that helped women going through separation and starting over. She used her story, without intimate details, to help others not lose themselves. Thus, she found a way to reframe what she had experienced. She began writing frequently, rekindled old dreams, and went back to school. She had encounters, timid attempts at new affections, but nothing permanent. She was still learning to love herself enough to not need to fill the void with other presences. She no longer blamed herself as before. But she also no longer victimized herself. She had reached a silent understanding of what she had experienced, and this understanding made her lighter, more whole, more prepared for whatever the future might bring. The reunion with Daniel was never mentioned again. It remained there, stored away, like an intimate memory, needing no revisiting. It served the purpose of sealing the past with respect. And that was enough. Neither of them sought further contact. It wasn't necessary. The love that had once united them had been real, but what held them together now was respect for who each had become. And that was the most silent and beautiful form of love they could offer each other in the present. One night, months after their reunion, Daniel went for a run alone. It was something he did often, part of the new habit he'd adopted. On the way back, passing a flower stand that was still open, he bought a small arrangement without much thought. When he got home, he handed it to the woman waiting for him on the porch, reading it. She smiled, surprised, and asked if there was a special occasion. He replied no. That flowers didn't need a reason. He just wanted her to know he was happy. And that, for a long time, he believed happiness would only come after some grand achievement, after a great story. But now he understood that sometimes happiness lies in simplicity, in coming home to someone who doesn't hurt, who doesn't deceive, who stays. The next morning, Clara was sorting through some old papers in a box. She found a photograph of her and Daniel, smiling at a party many years before. She stared at the image for a few seconds. There was no pain. There was a pang of longing, yes, but a pure longing. For who she had been, for who he had been. And, most importantly, for who she would never be again. She carefully put the photo away, closed the box, and placed it on top of the cabinet, as if sealing not an end, but a definitive new beginning. Their lives followed different paths, without forced intersections, without attempts to revive what no longer existed. But a certainty remained alive, albeit silently, in each of them. The certainty that what they had was real. That, despite everything, it was worth it. And that some stories don't have to last forever to be eternal. They just need to transform who we were and help us discover who we can be. There was still one more step. One last choice. Something that would show, once and for all, that the past was no longer a prison, but a bridge. And that step would be taken soon. In an unlikely place. At an unexpected moment. And it would change everything once again. The morning was bright, the sky clear, and the air carried that kind of light breeze that cradles beginnings. Daniel walked slowly through a park he hadn't visited in years, and he did so unplanned. He simply felt the urge to pass by there, where he had walked so many times, hand in hand with a memory that now lived in a safe compartment of his mind. He sat on a wooden bench near the lake and for a moment remained silent, watching a family playing with a dog, children running, laughter that hadn't belonged to him, but now seemed possible. There was no longer any guilt, no resentment. What lived within him now was something else, a kind of emotional maturity that arises when someone goes through the worst and still chooses not to carry hatred in their pocket. He felt grateful. For the pain that transformed him. For the losses that made room for new meanings. For the love he now received, which required no effort to be true. Right then and there, he decided to propose. Not on impulse, but because he knew that, at that moment in his life, he no longer wanted to live without the woman who now shared his days. The partnership they had built was solid, free of ghosts, based on the raw truth of feelings that needn't be disguised. He returned home with certainty in his heart. He bought flowers along the way, prepared a simple dinner, and in the middle of the night, with her laughter filling the room, he took a small box from his pocket and proposed. She didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't tremble, she just smiled with the certainty of someone who had known for a long time that this moment would come. Her yes was calm, beautiful, serene, like everything between them. There, Daniel knew his story had truly turned a corner. The happiness he felt was silent but firm, and no longer depended on what was left behind. It was the now that mattered. Clara, on the other hand, continued her life in new, silent cycles. She lived in a small, simply decorated apartment, filled with books and plants she had learned to care for herself. Volunteering became her profession. She began to be called upon to lead support groups, write articles, and participate in conversations about emotional renewal. She was respected, listened to, and sought out by women who saw in her a role model for rebuilding. And although Daniel's name was never mentioned publicly, she knew that much of the strength she conveyed came from the hard lessons she learned from losing him. At home, she still kept some old photos, tucked away in a box she rarely opened. But one day, while revisiting her old notebooks, she found a page with a draft of a letter she never sent. In it, she said that if he were ever happy with another woman, it would be his most just punishment and his most complete salvation. Rereading those words, she smiled. Not bitterly, but with the acceptance that only comes when the soul no longer struggles with what has passed. However, life, as always, was preparing a final meeting. An unresolved detail. A discreet return to where it all began, not to retrace paths, but to conclude with the clarity that the passage of years allows. Daniel and his fiancée were invited to a conference on human relations and were surprised to learn that Clara would also be there as one of the facilitators. They considered declining, to avoid the awkwardness, but they chose to go. Not out of nostalgia, but out of maturity. After all, they were at peace. They arrived early and sat discreetly. Clara entered the room with a firm posture, her hair shorter, her gaze steady. When she saw Daniel, her heart raced a little, but she continued. She spoke professionally, with empathy. At the end of the event, they crossed paths. There was no more tension. They exchanged few words. Clara said she was happy for him. And she was telling the truth. Daniel wished she would find someone who would see her calmly. He was sincere, too. She smiled, and so did he. And then they said goodbye. Without looking back. In the following months, Daniel married in an intimate ceremony, surrounded only by close friends and family. There was no grandiose party, no ostentation. Just a beautiful day, full of simplicity, truth, and possible promises. Clara, meanwhile, was in another city that day, at an event dedicated to supporting women starting over after abusive relationships. She felt whole there, as if every word she said was also for herself. She no longer sought redemption or applause. She simply did what she could with what she had, and that was enough. And then, time passed. Daniel continued building a life he never imagined he would have. He became the father of a daughter who came a few years later, and with her, he learned the purest kind of love. In his daughter's eyes, he saw a chance to do things differently, to teach the value of loyalty, listening, and love that doesn't hurt. Clara published a book years later, using her own story as a backdrop to discuss the emotional pitfalls of escape and neediness. The book didn't mention names, but those who knew her knew where those words came from. She became a silent reference to how it's possible to fall and rise again without destroying anyone in the process. Each followed a path that, in their own way, led them to the same place, emotional maturity. And even though their lives never crossed again in a profound way, they both knew that that story marked by love, pain, and new beginnings had been essential to becoming who they were. There was no longer room for resentment. Only for memories that, when they came, arrived with respect. And that was all they needed. Now that the story has come to an end, with each character receiving the fate their choices shaped, we want to know, what did you think of this journey? Comment below with your opinion. Your feedback is very important to us. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future intense stories like this one. And remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It destroys trust, kills plans, erodes respect, and breaks something within the other person that often never heals. This story shows us how thoughtless decisions can leave lasting scars. Love is a daily choice, and so is betrayal. Those who choose to betray, choose to lose. Those who choose to stay, choose to build. Rebuilding comes, but the price is high. And there's not always a return. This channel does not support, justify, or romanticize any type of betrayal. Here, we tell stories that reveal the reality behind the mistakes. Stories that teach, move, and warn. Until next time.